The coral beaches of Peleliu gleamed white under the tropical sun of September 15th, 1944, their pristine beauty masking the horror that would soon unfold. Major General William Rupertus stood aboard the command ship, studying the intelligence reports that promised his 1st Marine Division would secure this tiny island in just 4 days. The palm trees swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the lagoon sparkled like scattered diamonds, a postcard image of Pacific paradise that would soon become synonymous with some of the most savage fighting in Marine Corps history. Colonel Louis Burwell Chesty Puller paced the deck of his transport ship, the veteran Marine's weathered face set in grim determination. His 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, had already tasted victory at Guadalcanal and Cape Gloucester, but something about this operation felt different. The Japanese had been growing increasingly desperate, increasingly clever in their defensive tactics, and Peleliu's strategic position made it a prize that would not surrender easily. Below deck, 20-year-old Private First Class Eugene Sledge checked his rifle for the 100th time, his hands trembling slightly despite his best efforts to appear calm. The young Marine from Alabama had joined the Corps seeking adventure and glory, but the veterans around him spoke in hushed tones about what they expected to find on Peleliu. The island was small, only 6 miles long and 2 miles wide, but intelligence suggested that Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 14th Infantry Division had transformed every cave, every ridge, and every coral outcropping into a fortress. The pre-invasion bombardment had been thunderous and seemingly thorough. For 3 days, Navy ships had pounded the island with over 13,000 shells, while Army Air Force's bombers dropped countless tons of explosives on suspected Japanese positions. Smoke and dust clouds rose from the island like black thunderheads, and many Marines watching from their ships believed nothing could survive such devastation. They were tragically wrong, as referenced in Stephen Ambrose's comprehensive analysis in the Pacific War Chronicles. The Japanese had fundamentally changed their defensive strategy by 1944, abandoning the suicidal banzai charges that had proven so costly in earlier battles. Instead, Colonel Nakagawa had spent months preparing Peleliu's natural limestone ridges and coral caves into an interconnected network of defensive positions that could withstand even the most intensive bombardment. The landing craft engines roared to life at 0800 hours, their diesel fumes mixing with the salt spray as hundreds of Higgins boats and Amtraks formed the salt waves in the chopian waters off Peleliu's western shore. Sergeant John Boscilone's former comrades in the 7th Marines prepared to hit the northern beaches, while Puller's 1st Marines aimed for the treacherous southern approaches where the airfield lay. Hidden behind a wall of coral and jungle, Private Sledge gripped his carbine tighter as his Amtrak lurched through the surf, the tracked vehicle's armor plating already heating up under the tropical sun. Around him, Marines tried to joke and maintain the casual bravado that had carried them through other landings, but their eyes betrayed the knowledge that Peleliu would test them in ways they had never imagined. The island's defenders had spent the bombardment safely tucked away in caves that ran deep into the coral bedrock, and they were waiting with a patience and cunning that would turn this easy operation into a nightmare that lasted not for days, but 7 to 4 days of unrelenting combat. The first wave hit the beaches at 0-8-32 hours, and within minutes, the deceptive tranquility of Peleliu exploded into chaos. The moment the first Amtraks ground against Peleliu's coral beaches, the island erupted in a symphony of death. Hidden Japanese artillery pieces, perfectly sighted and protected in coral caves, began systematically destroying the landing craft with devastating accuracy. Private First Class Eugene Sledge's Amtrak lurched violently as a mortar shell exploded nearby, showering the Marines with coral fragments that cut like glass and salt water that burned their wounds. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines faced the most treacherous assignment, securing the southern beaches adjacent to the airfield that was supposedly Peleliu's primary strategic objective. As Puller's men struggled ashore, they discovered that the softened Japanese defenses were anything but neutralized. Every pillbox, every cave entrance, every coral ridge had been carefully prepared to create interlocking fields of fire that turned the beach into a killing ground. Captain Andrew Houghton's King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, pushed inland from Orange Beach only to find themselves caught in a maze of coral ridges that rose like broken teeth from the island's interior. The limestone formations, carved by centuries of Pacific storms, created natural fortifications that the Japanese had enhanced with concrete, steel, and an intricate network of tunnels that allowed defenders to appear and disappear like deadly phantoms. The promised 4-day operation began collapsing within hours of the initial landing. Major General Rupertus, still confident in his projections, watched from his command ship as casualty reports flooded in at an alarming rate. By noon on September 15th, the 1st Marine Division had already suffered over 200 casualties, and they had barely moved inland from the beaches. The Japanese defenders, following Colonel Nakagawa's carefully orchestrated plan, were bleeding the Marines white without revealing the full extent of their prepared positions. Sergeant Elmo Haney, a veteran of Guadalcanal, whose combat experience made him legendary among the younger Marines, led his squad through a coral maze that seemed designed by malevolent gods. Every advance brought them under fire from multiple directions, as Japanese soldiers emerged from spider holes and cave entrances that had been invisible. During the pre-invasion reconnaissance, the enemy's Type 96 light machine guns chattered from positions that appeared to be solid, rocked, while mortar shells dropped among the advancing Marines with mechanical precision. As documented in Robert Leckey's detailed account, Strong Men Armed, the Japanese had transformed Peleliu into what military historians would later call the most sophisticated defensive position encountered in the Pacific theater. The island's natural coral ridges had been honeycombed with over 500 caves, many of them connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to retreat from one position and emerge at another, creating the illusion that they faced an inexhaustible enemy force. Private Sledge found himself pinned down in a coral depression that offered minimal protection from the crossfire raking his position. The Marine beside him, a 19-year-old from Texas whose name he had never learned, suddenly jerked backward as a sniper's bullet found its mark. The young man's eyes widened in surprise before glazing over, and Sledge realized with shocking clarity that the adventure he had sought had transformed into something far more terrible than he had ever imagined. By nightfall on the first day, the Marines had established only precarious footholds on Peleliu's beaches. The airfield remained in Japanese hands, the ridges inland bristled with hidden defenses, and casualty reports painted a grim picture of the challenges ahead. Colonel Nakagawa's strategy was working perfectly instead of wasting lives in desperate charges. His defenders were forcing the Americans to pay in blood for every yard of coral and limestone. The tropical night brought no relief, only a different kind of terror as Japanese infiltrators emerged from their cave systems to probe Marine positions with deadly efficiency. Dawn on September 16th brought no respite from Peleliu's coral hell, only clearer visibility of the nightmare terrain that stretched inland from the bloodied beaches. Captain Andrew Howden's King Company faced the most daunting objective, a series of coral ridges that rose like prehistoric monsters from the island's interior, each one bristling with Japanese defensive positions that had survived the 3-day pre-invasion bombardment virtually intact. The ridge system that would later be dubbed Bloody Nose Ridge by the Marines stretched across Peleliu's northern sector like a jagged spine of coral and limestone. From his position near the base of the first ridge, Private First Class Eugene Sledge could see Japanese soldiers moving through cave entrances that appeared and disappeared like optical illusions in the morning heat. The enemy had transformed these natural coral formations into an underground fortress that seemed impregnable to conventional assault. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines attacked the ridges with the aggressive tactics that had served them well on other Pacific islands, but Peleliu's defenders had prepared for exactly this kind of frontal assault. As Marines climbed the coral slopes under murderous fire, Japanese soldiers would retreat into their cave systems, only to emerge at different positions and catch the attackers in deadly crossfires. The limestone absorbed the impact of rifle rounds and even bazookas, while carefully placed demolition charges brought down sections of coral to block Marine advances. Sergeant Elmo Haney led his squad up the first ridge in a series of desperate rushes, using coral outcroppings for cover while Japanese machine guns swept the slopes. With methodical precision, the veteran Marine had survived Guadalcanal by understanding his enemy's tactics. But the Japanese on Peleliu fought with a discipline and cunning that exceeded anything he had previously encountered. They refused to waste lives in banzai charges, instead fighting a calculated battle of attrition that turned every yard of advance into a costly victory. Major General Rupertus, still predicting a quick victory despite mounting evidence to the contrary, ordered continued attacks on the ridge system while refusing requests for additional Army support. The 1st Marine Division was stretched to its breaking point, with companies reduced to platoon strength and platoons fighting with squad-sized units. The coral dust and tropical heat created additional torments. Many Marines collapsed from heat exhaustion, while the razor-sharp coral shredded uniforms and equipment with equal efficiency. According to military historian Gordon Rotman's analysis in Peleliu, the bloodiest Pacific battle, the Japanese defensive strategy represented a fundamental evolution in Pacific warfare. Tactics. Colonel Nakagawa's 14th Infantry Division had studied previous American amphibious assaults and developed countermeasures specifically designed to neutralize Marine Corps' advantages in firepower and mobility. Private Sledge found himself trapped in a coral crevice halfway up the second ridge, pinned down by sniper fire from at least 3 different directions. The Marine next to him, Corporal Leiden, had taken a bullet through the shoulder, but continued returning fire with his M1 Garand. Despite the blood seeping through his dungarees, the sound of Japanese voices echoed from the cave systems above them, speaking in urgent whispers that suggested coordinated movement through the underground tunnels. The afternoon brought additional horror as Marines discovered that many of the coral caves contained not just defensive positions, but also ammunition dumps, command posts, and even underground hospitals where Japanese wounded continued fighting from their stretchers. By the end of the second day, Colonel Puller's 1st Marines had suffered over 400 casualties while advancing less than 400 yards inland. The ridge system remained firmly in Japanese hands, and intelligence estimates suggested that Colonel Nakagawa still commanded nearly 10,000 defenders. Distributed throughout Peleliu's Coral Fortress, the promised 4-day operation had already exceeded its timeline, and the worst fighting lay ahead. September 17th dawned with the acrid smell of curdite and burning coral dust hanging over Peleliu like a shroud. The 3rd day brought desperate measures as Colonel Chesty Puller realized that conventional Marine assault tactics were proving insufficient against the elaborate Japanese cave systems. Flamethrower teams became the spearhead of every attack, their terrifying weapons the only reliable method for neutralizing positions that had shrugged off artillery bombardments and direct hits from bazookas. Private First Class Eugene Sledge watched in horrified fascination as Corporal Womack advanced toward a cave entrance with his portable flamethrower, the heavy fuel tanks on his back making him an obvious target for Japanese snipers. The young Marine from Alabama had never seen combat before Peleliu, but he was learning that war on this coral island demanded a brutality that exceeded anything described in training manuals or Hollywood movies. Sergeant Elmo Haney's squad had spent the night clinging to positions on the lower slopes of Bloody Nose Ridge, enduring infiltration attempts and constant sniper fire from caves that seemed to multiply in the darkness. The veteran Marine had developed an almost supernatural ability to detect Japanese movement, but even his experience felt inadequate against defenders who could appear and disappear through tunnel systems that extended deep into Peleliu's coral foundation. Captain Andrew Holdan coordinated the morning assault on Ridge 240, the coral prominence that dominated the island's northern sector and served as the keystone of Colonel Nakagawa's defensive system. Intelligence reports suggested that the Japanese had carved over 100 connected caves into this single ridge, creating an underground fortress that could support defenders indefinitely as long as their ammunition and water supplies lasted. The flamethrower teams advanced under covering fire from Marine rifles and machine guns, but Japanese defenders had prepared for exactly this tactic. Carefully positioned riflemen targeted the flame operators from multiple angles, while other defenders used satchel charges and grenades to collapse cave entrances. After the flame teams had passed, trapping Marines in the maze of coral passages and cutting off their retreat routes, Private Sledge found himself part of a demolition team tasked with sealing smaller cave entrances. Using TNT charges and C2 explosives, the work required Marines to approach within feet of Japanese positions, often crawling across coral surfaces that offered no concealment, while enemy soldiers watched from hidden firing ports. Many of the caves proved to be decoys, elaborate constructions designed to draw American attention, while the real defensive positions remained hidden in adjacent ridges. As referenced in Eugene Sledge's own memoir With the Old Breed, the psychological toll of fighting on Peleliu exceeded even the physical casualties that were mounting at an alarming rate. Marines discovered that the coral caves often contained not just enemy soldiers, but also the decomposing bodies of Japanese defenders who had died during the pre-invasion bombardment, creating a stench of death that permeated every battle position and lingered in the tropical heat. Major General Rupertus finally acknowledged that his 4-day estimate had been catastrophically wrong, but he continued refusing Army support while insisting that the 1st Marine Division could secure Peleliu without assistance. This decision condemned thousands of Marines to additional weeks of combat against an enemy that grew more dangerous and desperate with each passing day. The afternoon assault on Ridge 240 cost King Company over 60% of its remaining strength, including Captain Holdan, who was killed by a Japanese sniper while directing his men against a particularly stubborn cave complex. His death devastated the company's morale and marked a turning point in the battle. Marines began to realize that Peleliu might not be survivable for anyone, regardless of their experience or leadership abilities. By nightfall on September 17th, the 1st Marine Division had suffered over 800 casualties, while controlling less than 1 square mile of Peleliu's 6 square mile area. The ridge system remained largely intact, and Japanese radio intercepts suggested that Colonel Nakagawa was successfully coordinating his defense from deep within the Coral Cave network, where American weapons could not reach him. The 4th day of fighting brought a horrifying realization to the Marines. Struggling against Peleliu's coral fortresses, they were not fighting a conventional battle, but rather engaging in a deadly form of three-dimensional warfare that extended both above and below ground. Colonel Kunio Nakagawa's 14th Infantry Division had created an underground city within the coral ridges, complete with command posts, ammunition dumps, hospitals, and living quarters that could support defenders for months of continuous combat. The tunnels extended far deeper into the coral than anyone had anticipated, with passages branching off in multiple directions, and chambers large enough to house entire platoons of Japanese defenders. The air inside was thick with coral dust, curdite smoke, and the sweet stench of decomposition that had become Peleliu's signature odor. Sergeant Elmo Haney had developed innovative tactics for cave fighting, using reflected mirrors to peer around corners and smoke grenades to force Japanese soldiers from hidden positions. The veteran Marine understood that conventional squad formations were useless in the narrow coral passages where a single defender with a rifle could hold up an entire company. Instead, his men fought in pairs, with one Marine providing covering fire while his partner advanced through the maze of tunnels and chambers. Colonel Chesty Puller established his command post in a captured Japanese bunker, surrounded by maps that showed the incredible complexity of Peleliu's underground defensive system. Intelligence estimates now suggested that the island contained over 800 individual cave positions, many of them connected by tunnels that allowed defenders to move undetected between ridges. The Marines were essentially fighting an invisible enemy that could strike from any direction and disappear into the coral bedrock before retaliation was possible. Captain Everett Pope's Company Charlie, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, discovered the largest cave complex yet encountered a multi-level underground fortress that extended over 200 yards into Ridge 240. Japanese engineers had carved sleeping quarters, ammunition storage areas, and even a surgery where wounded defenders continued fighting from their hospital beds. The cave's multiple entrances were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire, while carefully placed demolition charges could collapse entire sections if the position became untenable. The psychological warfare conducted by both sides intensified as the battle moved underground. Japanese soldiers would call out in English, taunting Marines about their casualties and promising swift death to anyone who entered the cave. Systems, Marines responded with their own psychological tactics, using captured Japanese equipment to create noise and confusion while advancing through the tunnel networks under cover of darkness. According to James Hallis's detailed analysis in The Devil's Anvil, the Japanese had spent over 8 months preparing Peleliu's defenses, transforming natural coral formations into what military engineers would later describe as the most sophisticated cave system encountered in the Pacific Theater. Colonel Nakagawa's strategy deliberately sacrificed territory in favor of inflicting maximum casualties on the attacking force, a tactical approach that proved devastatingly effective. Against Marine Corps' assault doctrine, Private Sledge found himself fighting alongside Marines he had never met before, as units became so intermixed during the underground battles that traditional organizational structure ceased to exist. Companies fought as platoons, platoons as squads, and squads as individual pairs of Marines who had learned to trust each other completely. In the deadly darkness of Peleliu's coral caves, by September 18th, casualty reports indicated that the 1st Marine Division had lost over 1,200 men, while securing less than 25% of Peleliu's total area. The Japanese defenders, protected by their underground fortress, had suffered proportionally fewer losses while maintaining their ability to coordinate defensive operations from positions that remained immune to American artillery and air strikes. September 20th marked the beginning of the second week of what had been promised as a 4-day operation, and the 1st Marine Division was approaching the breaking point of human endurance. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines had been reduced to less than 40% of their original strength, while individual companies counted their effective personnel in dozens. rather than the hundreds they had landed with 6 days earlier. Private First Class Eugene Sledge had aged years in less than a week, his boyish face now gaunt with exhaustion and streaked with coral dust that no amount of helmet water could wash away. The young Marine from Alabama had seen friends die in ways that would haunt his dreams for decades, and he had learned to kill with an efficiency that terrified him even as it ensured his survival. The adventure he had sought had transformed into an endurance test that pushed Marines beyond their physical and psychological limits. Major General William Rupertus finally acknowledged reality and requested reinforcement from the Army's 1st Infantry Division. But his pride prevented him from admitting that the Marine Corps had encountered an enemy they could not defeat using traditional amphibious assault tactics. The delay in requesting support cost additional hundreds of lives as Marines continued attacking positions that were virtually impregnable to conventional weapons and tactics. Sergeant Elmo Haney had developed an almost supernatural understanding of Japanese defensive techniques, but even his combat experience was proving inadequate against an enemy that fought with scientific precision and unlimited patience. The veteran Marine watched younger soldiers crack under the psychological pressure of fighting an invisible enemy that could strike from any direction at any time, then disappear into coral caves that seemed to extend infinitely into Peleliu's bedrock. Captain Everett Pope led the most desperate assault of the campaign, a night attack on the highest point of Bloody Nose Ridge that cost his company over 80% casualties, while gaining less than 100 yards of coral-strewn ground. The fighting had devolved into a primitive struggle for survival that bore little resemblance to the coordinated amphibious operations that had characterized earlier Pacific campaigns. Marines fought with knives, entrenching tools, and even rocks when ammunition ran low, while Japanese defenders employed similar desperation tactics from their underground positions. Both sides had exceeded their original tactical doctrines and were improvising deadly new methods of combat that would influence military thinking for generations. As documented in Harry Gailey's comprehensive study Peleliu, 1944, the battle had become a laboratory for testing the limits of human courage and endurance under conditions that exceeded anything previously encountered in modern warfare. The combination of tropical heat, coral terrain, and an enemy that refused to die created psychological stresses that broke down traditional military discipline and forced individual Marines to function as autonomous killing machines. By the end of the second week, casualty reports indicated that the 1st Marine Division had lost over 2,000 men, while controlling approximately half of Peleliu's total area. The Japanese defenders, still commanded by Colonel Nakagawa from his underground headquarters, continued coordinating resistance that showed no signs of weakening despite the enormous losses they had sustained. The promised quick victory had become a grinding battle of attrition that threatened to destroy the attacking force before the defending force was eliminated. October 12, 1944, marked the official end of organized Japanese resistance on Peleliu, but the date was largely meaningless to Marines who had learned that victory could be more terrible than defeat. After 7 to 4 days of continuous combat, the 1st Marine Division had achieved its objectives, but at a cost that would haunt the Corps for generations and raise fundamental questions about the strategic value of small island campaigns in the Pacific. Theater. Private First Class Eugene Sledge stood among the coral rubble that had once been Bloody Nose Ridge, surveying terrain that no longer resembled anything natural or recognizable. The limestone formations had been blasted into unrecognizable shapes by thousands of tons of explosives, while the cave systems that had sheltered Japanese defenders were now sealed tombs, containing the remains of Colonel Nakagawa's 14th Infantry Division. The young Marine from Alabama had survived Peleliu, but he understood that survival and victory were not synonymous. Colonel Chesty Puller's 1st Marines had ceased to exist as an effective fighting unit. Weeks before the battle's official conclusion, the regiment that had landed with over 3,000 men was reduced to a few hundred walking wounded who bore little resemblance to the confident amphibious assault troop who had hit Peleliu's beaches in September. Those who survived carried physical and psychological scars that would never completely heal, and many would never again function effectively in civilian society. The final tally of American casualties exceeded all projections and challenged fundamental assumptions about acceptable losses in amphibious operations. The 1st Marine Division suffered over 60% casualties, with some units reporting losses exceeding 90% of their original strength. Individual companies that had landed with 150 men were reduced to fewer than 20 effectives, while platoons that had started with 30 Marines counted their survivors in single digits. Sergeant Elmo Haney had become a legend among the surviving Marines. But the veteran warrior was a broken man who spoke in whispers and jumped at unexpected sounds. His expertise in cave fighting had saved countless lives, but the psychological toll of 74 days of continuous combat had exceeded even his considerable reserves of mental strength. The Marine Corps had created the most effective small unit fighters in military history, but they had also destroyed the men who achieved that effectiveness. Captain Everett Pope received the Medal of Honor for his leadership during the assault on Bloody Nose Ridge, but the award ceremony took place in a field hospital where he was recovering from wounds that would end his military career. His company Charlie no longer existed except as names on casualty reports, and the tactical objectives they had died securing proved to have minimal strategic value. In the broader context of the Pacific War, as documented in official Marine Corps historical records compiled by Henry Shaw and Bernard Nolte, the Battle of Peleliu represented both the pinnacle of American amphibious assault capability and the ultimate demonstration of its limitations. The Marines had proven they could defeat any enemy and secure any objective, but the human cost of such victories raised questions about whether the strategic gains justified the enormous losses in trained personnel. Private Sledge boarded a hospital ship bound for the United States on October 15th, carrying wounds that were both visible and invisible. The eager young man who had joined the Marine Corps seeking adventure and glory was gone forever, replaced by a combat veteran who understood that modern warfare could destroy souls as efficiently as it destroyed bodies. His memoir of the Peleliu campaign would eventually become one of the most powerful testimonies to the reality of combat ever written by an American serviceman. The Japanese defenders had achieved a kind of victory, even in death. Colonel Nakagawa's strategy of trading space for casualties had inflicted losses on the 1st Marine Division that exceeded anything previously experienced in Pacific warfare. His 14th Infantry Division had been annihilated, but they had proven that determined defenders with adequate preparation time could exact a terrible price from even the most elite assault troops in the world. The lessons learned at Peleliu would influence American military planning for the remainder of World War II and beyond, particularly the projected invasion of Japan itself. Military planners studying casualty reports from the coral ridges of Peleliu began calculating the human cost of assaulting the Japanese home islands, and their projections were so horrific that they contributed directly to the decision to use atomic weapons rather than accept the casualties that conventional invasion would require. The Battle of Peleliu ended not with celebration, but with the grim recognition that victory in modern warfare often demanded sacrifices that exceeded the moral and psychological capacity of the men asked to make them.